Thanks for everyone who's joining us here, and thanks for the people online. I'll be giving this talk as part of the Future Tech Week that's currently happening in Brussels and all over Europe, so there are several online events. And this is one of the 3 events of the WeNet project. So before we start, I'll be talking about value-driven adaptive norms. But before we get into that, let me just quickly tell you about the WeNet project. The WeNet project is a project we're partners in. It's called the Internet of Us. And it's about connecting people, finding the right people who can help us out and leveraging our diversity. That's WeNet very briefly. It's a project that started in January. It's a 4 years project, 4 years long. With 6.5 million budget and led by the University of Trento by Professor Guncilia. Okay, so I already introduced WeNet very briefly. We have a big number of partners. There's Trento that's leading this. There's a couple of partners on machine learning. That's the Open University of Cyprus and IIIA. We have a partner, Ben Gurion, that's focusing on incentives. There's us on norms and interaction models. The London School of Economics with their expertise on sociology. Our partners at Tübingen on ethics, focusing on the ethical issues. At Aalborg with their expertise on interaction design, they are leading the pilots. We have Hopper, an IT company leading the platform development. Martel, focusing on impact creation. And a number of universities from all over the world, from China, Mongolia, India, Peru, and Mexico, that will act as use case partners. So that's WeNet in a few words. Now I'll get into my talk. The first section of the talk will be a very brief introduction to norms and normative systems in general. So what are norms? Norms are basically what govern our behavior. And we should know that there are different types of norms. There are regulative norms. These are the norms of an institution, for example. An example of this would be the rules for a student to apply for a PhD at our institute. There are certain steps the student should do. There might be some deadlines. There are certain papers the student is obliged to send, and so on. These are regulative norms. Then we have legislative norms, and this is basically the law. So if I break the speed limit, what would happen? Or the taxes that I have to pay, and so on. Then we have social norms. These norms usually emerge in a society. They are not enforced. Examples of these would be, for example, if I'm in an elevator, I'd say hello to a stranger. I'd keep the door open for the person behind me. You clap at the end of the talk, even if it's very boring. These are examples of social norms. And then we have values and principles, and some people call these moral norms. Example of these are, for example, we want to make sure there's equality in our community, respect, reciprocity. These are the principles that would guide our behavior as well. And in some cases, some of these are regulative. They regulate our behavior, such as the regulative norms and the legislative norms. So these are the different types of norms. Norms have been studied in many different fields. In sociology, for example, they are interested in how norms can influence behavior, how norms can emerge, when and how would a person decide to adopt a certain norm. In philosophy, the focus has been on deontic logic, the axioms, the semantics, the paradoxes in that logic. In the legal studies, they're more interested in norms that regulate interactions, and there have been work on, for them, norms are deontic rules, and there have been work on norm enforcement, how to enforce norm, how to address conflicts if they arise. In neuroscience, for example, they studied how norms, the social influence of norms, how to persuade people to adopt them, the social conformity. In economics, for example, the influence market behavior, how norms influence market behavior. So norms have been really studied in many different fields, but today here we're interested in norms in AI in general and multi-agent systems in particular. In AI, the study of norms started with the field of AI and law, and there the focus has been on formalizing legal statements, reasoning about these statements, and argumentation, arguing when to apply a certain rule or not. Then in multi-agent systems, the interest in norms was basically to use norms as means to coordinate multi-agent interactions. And in the field of multi-agent systems, the focus has been on 4 main lines: norm representation, norm implementation, reasoning, and how are norms created. Our interest is mostly here, and this is what I will briefly talk about next, the 4 topics. Concerning norm representation, well, norms have mostly been based on deontic logic. To be more precise, deontic concepts, and like the deontic operators, like the obligation, the permission, what's forbidden, and so on, and the relations between these. But there are different ways to specify norms. For example, we can specify norms as if-then rules. And this is an example from the simple language. This is a formal language that is also executable, developed here by our colleagues, Carlos and Dave. If the auctioneer has announced the current price and no buyer has said mine, then the auctioneer can say next. That's an if-then rule. Then there is the deontic logic, the traditional thing, to specify permissions, obligations. You can add conditions if this condition is satisfied. You can add deadlines, when to do things before a certain deadline. There's event calculus, for example, and event calculus is usually used to specify programs. So this way, norms as specified in a procedural way, you specify what needs to happen. They can be specified as constraints and expectations. So here, if this event happens, then this is the expectation that we expect to happen. Commitments, you specify them as commitments. When does an agent commit to do what, during what time frame? And temporal logic. Temporal logic basically, for example, here, this states that it's obliged, that it is always the case if there's a west train waiting and the west light is red, then it's forbidden for the west train to enter the tunnel. And what's happening here, basically, there's a mapping between the deontic operators and the temporal operators. So essentially, you can see that the deontic concepts are there, even if they are implemented in different ways. So this is concerning norm representation. And the question is, if we have these norms, then how do we implement them? And there are two different ways to implement them. There's the norm regimentation and the norm enforcement. Norm regimentation is to ensure that the norms are followed. Usually the common way is through mediation, like the electronic institutions, where the system tries to ensures that the norms are being followed, or hardwiring. The agent is actually developed to follow these specific norms, and that's it. So norms cannot be broken. However, we cannot always regiment all norms. So for example, it's difficult to oblige someone to act in a certain way. We have our autonomy, the agents are autonomous. So this is not always possible. And sometimes it's not possible, we also do want to maintain the agent's autonomy, and hence we don't want to always regiment the norms. And this is where we go into norm enforcement. To enforce norms in alternative means. And here we have 3 different types. Self-enforcement, where the agent tries to adhere to norms. Second-party enforcement, so if I am interacting with another, then that other person can either retaliate or reciprocate to try to push me to act in a certain way. Then there's the third-party enforcement. For example, the system can actually lower my reputation. As a result of that, the other members of the community will stop interacting with me. That's social enforcement. Or the system can actually punish me in a certain way, and that's institutional enforcement. The work has mostly been on norm regimentation and third-party enforcement in the multi-agent systems work. So that's concerning implementation. Another line of work is reasoning about norms. How do we understand norms? How do we check their properties, their implications? So that's norm diagnosis. There is also work on conflict resolution. So one rule might say that I am permitted to perform a a given action. Another rule, if a certain condition is satisfied, you might say that now I'm forbidden to perform the action. Which one do I follow? So sometimes inconsistencies arise, and conflict resolution is to deal with those. Norm compliance, this is more about on the agent level. So the agent needs to decide whether it will obey a certain norm or not. It needs to calculate the cost of obeying the norm versus the cost of not obeying the norm, the sanctions, and so on. That's concerning norm reasoning. Then there is the norm creation. The norm creation, there are two different ways to do this, the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach. In the top-down approach, the initial work has been on offline design. An engineer will sit and program the system to act in a certain way, and that's it, the norms are set. Or the organization will sit down and decide on the rules that will govern their behavior. That's offline design. We also have online design. Well, norm synthesis is an example, and one example of this work is the system would actually try to detect if there are conflicts, try to detect if certain agents are not abiding by the norms, and when this is detected, the system will try to analyze and suggest new norms. So it's driven by conflict detection. There's work, this is left in gray because it doesn't really try to learn new norms, but there are learning mechanisms that have been used to learn parameters of norms, learn punishment, or learn incentives, as our colleagues are doing in the WeNet project from Bangalore. So this is the top-down approaches. Then there's the bottom-up approach, and when we talk about bottom-up, usually the first thing people think about is norm emergence, how norms emerge in a certain community. And the work done here has usually focused on how do agents internalize norms, when and how. And usually it's said that norm emergence would trigger a top-down norm creation. So when certain behavior arises in a certain community, then norms will be enforced from a top-down approach. However, there's another option for bottom-up approaches, and that's norm agreement. And this is what the remaining of the talk will focus on. So I move into the second section of the talk, and that's our proposal for value-driven adaptive norms. So how do you argue this? How do you argue for this, the value-driven adaptive norm? You say, okay, norms are based on our requirements. We essentially have norms to try to help us fulfill our requirements. And we're adding to this that we should also have norms based on our values to ensure that our behavior is aligned with our values. So the bottom line is that norms are based on our requirements and values. And as a result, as our values and requirements are always changing with time, we need norms to adapt to these evolving requirements and values. And as such, the technologies should also be mediated by these adaptive norms. Since we're talking about, just so that I don't keep on referring to norms, requirements, and values, I call this one the ethical code. We call it the ethical code because values is an important part of it. And I'll give you an example to motivate our vision for value-driven adaptive norms. So we have the UHelp app that has been developed at our institute. The UHelp app essentially allows one to look for help within their social network. The app would crawl one social network looking for trusted volunteers. The search is based on the trust, how much you trust people, and on the friendship level. So you might say, I just want friends for this task, or I accept friends of friends, and so on. So in this scenario, we have a mother that's running late at work. She needs someone to pick up her daughter Cecilia from school and take her to her karate class. She receives a number of volunteers, and she chooses Dave, who's a trusted friend of a friend. All goes well, but then Dave in the evening informs her that the school was not happy with the authorization that it received from the UHelp app. What can the mother do? She decides to go online on the UHelp app and bring this issue with her fellow community members. She suggests to add the identity number to people's profiles. This starts a discussion amongst the members. Some people are pro, some people are against. Values can be discussed here. So for example, some people might say they are against this because this breaches their privacy. They don't want to share their ID number. Others are pro because they say this is very important for the security of their children. Other arguments might be like, this is a community of parents and hence this request is required a lot and we need to address it. They vote, they reach an agreement. In this case, the agreement is that the ID is added to the profile as an optional field. Whoever doesn't fill this data is not asked to pick up children from school. So this is an example that illustrates how our requirements change over time, how our values not only change over time, but change depending on the context. So in one context, I value security over privacy, in another, I value privacy over security, and so on. And it illustrates how the technology should adapt to this. So the same YouHelp app might have different roots in a different community because they might value different values in a different way. So that's the motivating example. What do we need to do to get there? We say, okay, so the technology will basically evolve with our evolving ethical code. We divide this evolution cycle into 4 phases. The first one is the agreement of the ethical code. This is when the people get together and discuss and try to agree on their ethical code. A number of technologies are needed here. So first thing is agreement technologies, including arbitration, negotiation, trust and reputation, computational social choice. Learning is also useful here. So the system can learn and suggest when norms should be changed, if goals are not being fulfilled, if people are not happy with their community. It can learn the best norms for this community, learn the consequences of norms, and there is a bunch of technologies that can be used: machine learning, case-based reasoning, simulations to try to predict the impact of certain norms, sentiment analysis to try to detect if people are happy or not, and so on. That's the first phase. People discuss and eventually reach an agreement on what their ethical code should be. The second phase is to take that ethical code that had been written in a natural language, or maybe a constrained natural language, and translate it into a formal language so we can read, so that the system can reason about it, so that it can try to detect conflicts, for example. And if it does detect conflicts, it can go back to the users and inform them. What are the technologies needed for this phase for automatically translating the ethical code from text to a formal language? The first is the logic for norms, and we've discussed this. There's plenty of approaches for specifying norms. The second is natural language processing, and there's also plenty of work on translating a text from natural language into a formal language. In this case, we need to extract the modalities and their parameters from the text. So we have the formalized ethical code. Now we need the system to implement it. We call this the automated operationalization of the ethical code. And here there's plenty of work in the field of normative systems, which regiment norms. There are different ways to specify the norms here through processes, if-then statements, constraints, and so on. Then there's formal verification. We need to make sure that the system, the software that we have at the end, actually does help us fulfill our requirements and adhere to the values. So formal verification is needed. We have the software now at the end of the stage. The software is mediating our interaction, following our norms. While we're interacting online, we can have norm enforcement mechanisms that will monitor what we're doing, that might provide incentives at runtime, that might push us when in certain situations. And the last thing is that as this whole process, so the first part is done by the users, the remaining part is fully automated. And as such, the interface of the system should also adapt in an automated manner. So we need automated GUIs. So that's, sorry, 1 second. Okay. So that's our vision. There are several research challenges here. The first is actually closing the whole life cycle. So all the technologies that I've mentioned, there have been plenty of work on these technologies. There have been plenty of work on agreement technologies, plenty of work on learning, on natural language processing, on normative system, regimentation, enforcement mechanism, on formal verification, However, the tricky part is putting all these building blocks together, connecting them together to be able to move around. So moving from the natural language to the formal logic language that you can reason about, and then implement this in the software and so on. So this is the tricky part. Another thing is introducing values in the system. So values is a relatively new concept in our field. In the last couple of years, we've started hearing about values much more. And some of the challenges are these. So how do we actually link values with norms? Or how can we have value-driven agreements? And there is some work on this. Or how do we specify values in the first place? That's not an easy task. Specifying values, and even more difficult is verifying values, verify whether a certain value is fulfilled. So these are all open challenges. And the last one is giving people control. So it's true that the whole vision is based on this idea, but this is still a challenge, giving people control. Examples from real world, what have we done to the oceans, for example, water resources, to the forests, to the fossil fuel resources, atmosphere, to the wildlife. And this is what's known by the tragedy of the commons that Nardine made popular in '68, saying that freedom in the commons brings ruin to all. However, he received lots of criticism, and one of those was Elinor Ostrom, who actually said, well, there are many cases in the world where people have been organizing themselves very successfully for ages. And she spent some time in several of these communities, such as the forests in Switzerland, Japan, the irrigation systems in Spain, Philippines, the fisheries in Indonesia. And what she came up with, and she's the only female who received a Nobel Prize in economics for this specific work. She came up with a set of rules, a set of requirements that would, for effective self-organization, if you want. It's true, when we're talking about the commons, the focus is usually on shared limited resources, but this issue, the problem and the proposed solutions, they can be applied to any situation where we have a conflict between short-term self-interest and the long-term common good. And this is our case here. Okay, so we'll quickly go over these requirements, which he calls them the 8 design principles. The first is having clearly defined boundaries. In our case, this means that we have to clearly define the resources, which in this case are the system that is being used, and the ethical code that people might discuss and try to agree upon. A clearly defined set of the people who are involved. Who are the people that are affected in this? Who are the people that can take a role in this, and so on. The second is the congruence requirement, and this essentially states that the rules mediating the interactions should match the local requirements and conditions. So this is what our vision is based on. We don't specifically implement this, and I'll get back to this issue at the end of the talk. Same thing with here, collective choice arrangements. The idea here is that the people affected by the rules are the people who should have a say in managing and modifying these rules. Again, this is our vision, our motivation. We don't have anything that explicitly implements this, and I'll get back to this as well at the end of the talk. Then there's the monitoring. If we go back to the vision that I've described, so at the norm enforcement stage, this is where the system actually monitors how we're doing, implements sanctions when needed. There's conflict resolution mechanisms that we need to have in place. These should be accessible, they should be fair. Another requirement is the minimal recognition of rights to organize. This essentially says that so anyone has the right to self-organize, and this shouldn't be challenged by an external authority like government and so on. Then the last one is the condition for nested enterprises. So basically, if it is the case where the system is part of a larger system, that you need to make sure that on all levels, these are being addressed. So that's it. These are the requirements. I think we're doing fine. Now, okay, so the next section of the talk is on the ethical implementations of our work. So we're saying we're working on value-driven adaptive norms. There has been lots of talk in the AI community on ethics and AI. I will not get into this. There are plenty of sources online that interested people can go to, such as the Open Letter on AI, the Islam AI Principles, the Barcelona Declaration on AI. And amongst these set of principles, there are a few that I believe our proposal addresses some aspects of these principles. So for example, there's the human control. So the proposal is based on giving people control. And it's based on trying to address people's requirements. And hence we touch upon the shared benefits principle. There's the issue of privacy and value alignment. For me, I view privacy as one of the values. This is why I put them together in this bundle. Again, the proposal is based on having the system based on our values to make sure we're aligned with our values. So we're also touching upon these topics. And the last is transparency. So we're saying the people are writing the norms, or the people can read and discuss the norms. The norms can be read in a natural language or a constrained natural language. And hence there is transparency. The behavior of the system, which is dictated by the norms, is transparent to the users. However, at our institute, we have specifically done some work on value alignment, which I will share with you in the next few minutes. So, what have we done here? For us, first of all, we start by thinking about what are values. So for us, values are preferences. They are preferences over the state of the world. So, for example, if I value gender equality, then I will prefer a world where the male and the female salary is equal to a world where it is not. So values essentially are defined as preferences over the states of the world. I will not get into the details in this talk. I just present the general concept. If you're interested in the details and the equations, then I would refer you to our paper. Okay, so if we have the preference of one person or one agent with respect to a given value, then through aggregation functions, we can have the preference of that person over a set of values. Or we can have the preference of a group of people with respect to that value. Or we can even calculate the preference of a group of people over a set of values. The aggregation functions that we propose in the paper are very simple, but yeah, I won't present them here. Okay, so we have the preferences of people. The next question is what is value alignment for us? How do we define it? And we say, okay, so one is aligned with a value if their actions move them towards the preferred states for that value. So I'm aligned with the gender equality value if my actions move me toward preferred states where there's the salaries are equal and so on, and not far away from them. So here we're connecting actions with values. And actions or behavior is governed by norms, and hence we can talk about the alignment of norms with values. What norms do is change the state of the world, how the world functions. So here we have two different cases. In a world with no taxes, I receive my salary, the money in my pocket will increase by the amount of that salary. In a world with taxes, let's say 20% taxes, I receive my salary, the money in my pocket will increase by 0.8 that salary, that amount. So essentially, when we have a given world and we apply a norm to that world, what's happening here is that it's changing the states in that world and changing the transitions in that world. We have a new transition system at the end. Okay, and then we say, so if this is a transition system where a given norm is applied, how can I assess the degree of alignment of that norm with that value? Something I missed to mention is that everything we're calculating is from the point of view of a specific person, a specific agent, always, because values are personal, they're for an individual. Principles are for communities usually, and values are something individual. And each one of us will have this, will value one value over the other in a different way. Okay, so the degree of alignment of a norm with a value for a given agent. Basically, what we do here is we accumulate the preferences of all the transitions in this transition system. It's an aggregation of all the preferences for all the transitions. What we are doing is we're considering all possible paths, and we're giving equal weight to all possible paths and all transitions. So that's a big assumption we're doing, but that's our initial work for now. That's not very efficient. So to help this, we apply the Monte Carlo sampling. Basically, we select a sample of paths and we limit their length. So X is the sample and L is the length. And we do the same thing. That's our very initial proposal for value alignment, very basic. But the same way as we can aggregate preferences for a group of values or a group of people, we can do the same thing with the alignment, the value alignment. So we say you can assess the alignment for a group of people or for a group of values. And if we have the alignment of one norm with respect to a value, then we can also calculate the relative alignment. So the relative alignment of norm 1 with respect to norm 2, it's essentially the difference between the two. And again, we can aggregate the relative alignment for a group of agents or for a group of values. So that's it. The research questions in this line of work, here, how to define the aggregation functions. We have very initial proposals here, very basic proposals that need to be revisited. What if not all paths and transitions are equiprobable, and that's usually the case, so this is something that we need to address. Then, given what we've presented, we can also come up with new questions, new interesting things that we can assess. For example, given a set of norms N, a set of values V, and a set of agents G, we can then try to see which subset of norms is, which subset of norms with optimal alignment can we have for group G, or which subset of agents are best for the set of norms N, or which is the best aggregation function, the most optimal one that we can get. So that's the ethical implications section. We've talked about the positive things, but there's always the positive and the negative. So now we'll talk about the negative things and the ethical concerns of what I've just presented. So we go back to the main topic, as you can see, that's popping up everywhere. Are we sure we want to give the users full control? And here, as soon as we mention this, the what-ifs start popping up. So people will start asking, what if dictatorships arise? What about the rights of the minorities? What if people fail to agree? And many, many more. The main question we're asking here is, what if people make wrong decisions? And what we're focusing on in this section, talking about wrong decisions, what's wrong is usually the illegal or the unethical. So how do we address these issues? So what if people make wrong decisions? The simple, straightforward answer would be give people control, yet maintain that legal and ethical requirements are not broken. It's easy to say, it's difficult to implement, but it's very interesting to start looking at these issues. As a summary, so what we're trying to say here is that what drives the evolution of our technologies is not just the social requirements, it's not just what people require or need, it's the evolution of all the ethical, legal, and social requirements. We should look at these three all together. And there are plenty of research challenges here. So for example, the first is trying to understand the ethical, legal, and social dynamics. And how does one impact another? So the evolution of our ethical requirements sometimes affects our legal requirements, which in turn affect our social requirements, and so on. Another problem is how to encode ethical and legal requirements into the system. That's also a very challenging problem. So let's start with the first issue. So, as I said, the ethical can influence the legal can influence the social can influence the ethical, and so on. I'll go through a few examples here. So for example, from ethical to legal, and GDPR is one of the examples. So after lots of talk about our privacy as an important value for us. The European Commission at the end issued this new law that would try to protect our privacy and protect our data. So this is an example of moving from how the ethical might trigger the legal requirements to evolve and change. Another example is sometimes we do need to violate privacy. So our colleagues at the Computer Vision Institute next door, they've been working on trying to detect when someone is suicidal on the social networks. And to do that, number one, you're checking people's data. Number two, what to do if you detected that someone is suicidal. If the person refuses to share his data with someone, shall you inform the parents, the family? Shall you inform the authorities, the doctors? So what's happening here is actually we have two different values. We have the value of privacy and we have the value of the well-being of the person. And the question is, which one is more important? And to address such problems, we need to again change the law again to say in some situations, actually to say which situations and how to breach privacy when needed. So this is another example. Then there's from the social to the ethical and vice versa. So for example, GDPR again, a couple of decades ago, no one was thinking about their privacy, their online data, it wasn't an issue. Then we started seeing how it's being abused, and us as people, we started getting really annoyed, and this suddenly became something important in our lives. So this social requirement became important, and this affected the ethical requirements and so on. So GDPR is again another example here. Gender equality. So several decades ago, the females weren't able to vote, and then with change, sometimes it's not clear which one is affecting the other. Is it the ethical that's changing the social, or vice versa? And then the last one is from legal to social. So sometimes we actually need to change the legal requirements to be able to change how we behave. So examples here are speed limits. So coming from Lebanon, I can say that the way I drive has changed. I have changed as a person. My behavior has changed given the different rules in this country. Another example is smoking. By changing the law, making cigarettes much more expensive, prohibiting cigarettes in close places, and so on. Our behavior as people did change with time. So here we can see how the legal actually affects the social. So we have these examples. Now let's talk about the other challenge, encoding the ethical, the legal requirements into the system. This is not easy. It might be easier a bit in the legal case. So the legal requirements may be encoded in a way similar to social requirements. The ethical requirements are much more tricky. Sometimes we don't know how to actually define gender equality or fairness, so that's not an easy topic. Other than that, we also need to differentiate between absolute moral principles and values. And if you remember that when we were talking about the requirements, the 8 requirements set by Osman, so we can say that in a certain system, for example, all the people affected by the rules must be given the opportunity to take role and manage these rules. As such, we can see the norms that mediate these interactions. Some of them might be absolute, that cannot be changed, to make sure that certain absolute principles are not broken, while others can be discussed and agreed upon by the community. So this is also something to remember. And that's it. That's the end of my talk. Take-home message, just to summarize. So what I've presented here. So we have norms. We use norms to regulate our behavior. Norms should adapt to our evolving requirements and values. I've mentioned that adaptive norms requires extensive research in different fields. We've talked about agreement technologies, natural language processing, normative systems, and so on. And we've talked about the ethical concerns, which are very interesting, but very, very, very tricky. But it would be very nice to start working on these. Amongst these issues would be understanding the value-norm relationship, formalizing the value alignment problem, which we've just started working on, understanding the ethical, legal, social dynamics, and encoding ethical and legal requirements. When we talk about encoding ethical and legal requirements, so we're talking about specifying, implementing, verifying, and that's it. So I want to say thanks because lots of, well, everything here has been in collaboration with Carlos Sierra. Lots of work presented have been in collaboration with Pablo Noriega and Pilar de Yonde and Jordi Sabater. And thanks to the APFL and Symbol, the members of the APFL and Symbol projects, because this has also been in collaboration with these projects. And thanks to you, and that's it. Questions?
You need to turn it. With the questions be recorded.
Yeah. Okay.
I can start with a sort of soft question, but it was just funny because I'm part of a group in the Australian Computer Society that deals with exactly with AI and ethics. And this morning we had a meeting because we've been given a task to try to create a white paper on how to actually implement the whole thing into Australia. Australia feels that it's a little bit behind, lagging behind. Europe is going ahead and so on. And we get the pressure from the data sharing community. They're accepting, and you touched on that. They're accepting a model trying to accept a model from the UK, from 5 data safeties. I won't get into that one. And the other thing is that the legal people are driving. We're sitting with people that don't know. And we got stuck the whole morning in what is good AI and how it can be implemented, and how the algorithmic part of the behavior can be implemented. So in this sense, I mean, your talk is great, but really that part of this high-level notion of good AI, which will come from policies and from documents, how that can boil all the way down to systems and design principles. Can you sort of elaborate a little bit on that? Because my understanding is that this is exactly in that space, and it's a great sort of initiative and a great project. And I'm starting to think how that can be sort of.
Yeah. So what I presented here, the first part, the proposal focuses mostly on the technologies that mediate our online behavior. And we do that through norms, as I said. So I believe norms is the key, because norms is what mediates behavior. And when we're talking about ethical, we're talking about good or bad behavior. So one approach is regulating this behavior, and to do that, we can do this using norms. There might be many other things that are critical that I did not touch upon. For example, explainability in machine learning. So this has been left outside. This is why when I presented the AI principles, we're just touching upon some of the principles, and in specific ways. There are still other problems to address. But yes, concerning behavior, how the system behaves, norms can be one approach. And if we can try, it is a very difficult problem, but if we can try to align these norms to our values, and if we can try to verify that certain values are adhered to, then this, I believe, would be one huge success. So
I can go firmly back and say, look, the norms and connecting them with values is the way to go to implement the notion of good AI. Right?
Yeah, yeah. My view, my approach. Given my biased background, for sure, but yes.
I think there's a dimension that is missing in what you explained. That is missing explicitly. Probably it's somewhere hidden and maybe you can help me to find it. And this is the ontological aspect, or the semantic aspect. You mentioned a little bit when you talked about the clearly defined boundaries, or the boundaries. Ontology in some way is establishing boundaries because you define what things are and are not, and so on. It has an influence on the values and then ultimately also on the norms. You can, in the evolution and the diversity that is tackling this problem, it's not only that values change and therefore norms have to be adapted, but also what you understand, what exists and not exists, and what your ontology may also change. And that has an impact on the values of the norm. So you can agree on the norms, you can agree on the values, but the ontologies are different and the conflicts arise as well. So I think it is very necessary to put also this dimension and to make it explicit in this work of value adaptation.
I fully agree with you. You are absolutely right. As I said, what I've presented here is definitely biased by my background. Ontologies should be added. They would ideally be added to the first phase if you want to think about the life cycle. This is where people discuss and agree and try to reach agreements. And it's very important. And sometimes they might reach agreements, as you said. They might realize that the definitions are not aligned with each one's interpretation, and then they might eventually go back and change this. But I fully agree that in the first phase the ontology alignment is crucial. Absolutely. I should add it next time I present this.
When you were talking about, this may be technical, but values, as I remember, is a notion that arises in AI and computational argumentation. In there, when you have basically the idea that a certain argument promotes one value, but you can have another argument. It's the first that promotes another value, and then each individual may have like a partial ordering between the values. It seems to me that you are not doing that here. I mean, you don't have arguments per se, you have values, but you have norms that promote values and how this is established, and you have not partial preferences between values. You see that the values are preferences, and this was a little bit confusing. Because in computational argumentation, you have a preference on each individual has a partial order of preference on the values. So I prefer this value to the other one.
Yeah.
But the values per se, they are not preference.
Yes, so this is a different topic that we didn't touch upon. And this is when you talk about arguing about values and which value do you prefer. So this would happen in the first stage of the life cycle when people are discussing, do we value privacy in this community over security or security over privacy? So what you're talking about is preferences over the values themselves. What we're talking about is a different thing. I fully agree with you, and this is a different problem. So this is arguing about values, which
No, it's not arguing.
No?
It's when you have contending arguments, you have to prefer one to another. So I
Prefer
can
one
go to
value
the
over the
conference
other,
or I can
right?
go to the beach. One promotes a value, which is my well-being, and the other promotes my value, which is my professional duty.
yes,
And the way to select one to the other is in fact preferring one value to the other.
yes. So preferring one value to another. What we're saying here, we are defining what is a value itself. So if I prefer having free time with the family, then which action? So here, I'm defining the value itself, one single value, as preferences over the sake of the work. So if I prefer the time with the family, then where do I rather be? At work in the evening or with the family in the evening? That's defining one single value. I think you're talking about what value do I prefer, and using that as making a decision of which action to do. And that's what needs to be done, but that's not what we. So it's a different problem, I think, if I understand you correctly.
I think the work done so far is a bit more related to finding which are the norms that promote certain values the most. So it's looking into the space of norms more than the problem. Your problem is also an important one.
Yes.
But the work done so far is about finding the right norms for the values of the community each year. So that's the problem.
You said the principles are shared by the community, but values are individual. Each individual have a hierarchy of values. You have left wing versus right wing. Typical political science example is that you have liberty versus equality. The right wing has in higher status liberty, the left wing has equality in a higher status. And this is what our times can be.
What you're addressing, if I go into the slides when I talked about the values, I think it's hidden somewhere. So somewhere I say, how do you aggregate the preference of a group with respect to a set of values? And we have very naive initial equations, and what you've mentioned would go there. It should modify how we actually achieve this aggregation. How do we do this aggregation? Okay. Well,
Say goodbye.
thank you very much. Thank you very much for the people online. And